Decisions and actions, often the trade of managers. Yes, they have to make decisions. Yes, they have to have strong actions. And yes, they have to be aligned. But aligned to what? Are they really aligned to the vision? Are they really aligned to the end that the leader in the organization really has to have them aligned to? Do they really recognize the context in which these decisions and actions make any sense? Often organizations, as I said earlier, are driven to certain actions by its very nature. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is not unusual that the Air Force representative would be recommending air power and talking about surgical strikes and talking about bringing in interceptors and then bombers and taking out air defense and so forth, and that be the recommended course of action. And not unusual for the Army to recommend invasion and holding, occupying, and pacifying and nation building. There's nothing unusual about a Navy position bringing in blockade and the interdiction of materials and quarantine. But at the same time, I think we ought to be a little bit more conscious of the possible decision-making models from which many of these kinds of decisions come. There are many different models, and you have studied or will study in the Executive Development Program, Bowman and Deal's various lenses for looking on situations, whether that lens is a structural lens or the human relations lens or the political lens or a symbolic lens. You'll find very many similarities, but some differences with the three models that NISL is using. These models, by the way, are not exclusive of one another. So when we talk about a rational actor model, or we're talking about organizational model, or talking about bureaucratic politics model, they are not exclusive of one another. In fact, various aspects of any situation would be dominated by one model of decision-making over another. These are the ones we've chosen because the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, has been brilliantly explained and explicated using Graham Allison and Zeliko's Essence of Decision, from which you have an excerpt. It is also sort of the background and underpinnings of the readings and thinking in time. And the second edition of 1999 of Essence of Decision by Graham Allison and Philip Zelikow really recommend that this political science set of models be extended into the social sciences because they have had so much good depth in having students do that kind of work and find the models applicable to very many other kinds of enterprises. And because we chose the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, this is the set of models that we recommend to you. We'll refer to these models often across NISL. So with that in mind, that these are decision-making models, that there are others, that they're non-exclusive of one another, and that they fit very nicely into education as much as into political science, let me use the Cuban Missile Crisis to explicate some of these, the main points in these models. And then you can use them to apply to your situation and to your own decision making. First of all, the rational actor model. Now, rational actor model. This is a view that players in decisions actually are actors therein. And actors have personalities, have characters, show that personality there. The assumption in a rational actor model is that these are the acts of individuals, that it is very important to know who those individuals are, a Khrushchev and a Kennedy, who Castro is, who are the heads of each of the services, who's Dean Rusk, and how does Dean Rusk play in a set of decisions with a State Department now run by the Democrats. What's the background of all of these folks, and what do they bring to the table? We also understand that their purpose of actions. There is a logic in a rational actor model you believe that there is a syllogism. If then, a major premise, a minor premise leading to a conclusion. If you're using a rational actor model, you even believe that nation states act in their own self-interest and that they have objectives and that they have interests and it's not an insane world. I'm reminded of a line from G.K. Chesterton. An insane man is not one who's lost his reason, but rather one who's lost everything but his reason. So Chesterton is actually saying that even an insane man works by an interior logic. The difference between insanity and sanity in that world is allowing in facts from outside to change the reality of what the internal logic is. So a rational actor, truly rational actor, would rely on data, would rely on evidence, would rely in anything that will help that actor solve a problem. Rational actor models solve problems. They're always looking for consequences. What are the consequences of my actions? What are the inferences of those consequences? What are the alternative courses of action that I can offer? And what would those consequences be for each of those? So it's all about choice, and it's all about actions. So if we talk about this in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we go back to Kennedy saying, why is he doing this to me? To me, it's all very personal. Why would he do this? Gromyko just said the following, or Khrushchev said the following. All very, very personal. What could they be thinking? What are the Russians up to? A logic to it. So that if you got the answer to those during your 6 days of debate, you ought to be able to run all of the logic of what they could be up to and then make a judgment about what they are up to and then make a further judgment about what your decisions and actions would be. You're constantly, in a rational actor model, putting yourself in the shoes of the other person. So that's one model. Another of the models is organizational behavior model. And this is also evident in the Cuban Missile Crisis in that the organizations themselves bring a certain reality. You'll remember that the Strategic Air Command, that is the command at the time in charge of nuclear aircraft and missiles, Navy, of course, had a piece of that with nuclear weapons at sea, but the Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2. That's defense condition number 2. Defense condition number 1 is at war. It is the only time that I'm aware of since World War II that we ever went to DEFCON 2. And that is amazing to think that we were at that level of readiness with our own nuclear weapons, both bombers and missiles for the retaliatory strike, DEFCON 2. Then Kennedy at one point asks, well, what about those planes down in Florida? How are they on the aprons of their runways? And the answer back, well, they're tip to tip, wing to wing to wing. And he said, did we learn nothing out of Pearl Harbor? Did we learn nothing? There's a standard operating procedure, wing tip to wing tip. The movement of air, land, and sea forces all went by standard operating procedure. So organizations themselves, and this is not a criticism, they have standard operating procedures. So the Navy in this case knows how to set up a blockade, how to set up a quarantine. And so you have the now infamous exchange between the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara. And that exchange was over the firing a shot across the bow of a Soviet cargo ship and McNamara getting exercised because the Navy had taken that on themselves and being told quite bluntly that the Navy had been running these kinds of operations for over 200 years and inviting the Secretary to go back to his own office. So there are outputs, there are standard operating procedures, there are set pieces, and folks bring from those organizations their own procedures and processes. The policies become mechanical in a way, and the expectations from an organizational behavior model are precisely those that historically have come from that kind of an organization. And you have underneath that all the organizational theories and imperatives about readiness and about movement and about decisions. A third of the decision-making models is bureaucratic politics model. That really has to do more with people who are engaged in this, not the rational actor, but a sort of combination of the actors within an organization. And that organization often will be engaged bureaucratically in bargaining, game theory, that there are winners and losers. Often when you're at a bureaucratic politics level, you are sending lesser principles. So let's go back to the XCOM. The president decides that he is not going to attend those meetings. So why would a president, in potentially the most catastrophic set of events in the history of mankind, decide not to attend the meetings of the XCOM? Well, it's the intrusion of the leader in the process. Just like in science, Heisenberg's principle is the intrusion of the observer. It changes all of the viewpoints. You would have much less likelihood that someone at a lower level would express an idea that would be counter to the flow if you allowed the most senior people into the bureaucratic politics decision making. So lesser folks, but important folks, I don't mean lesser in any moral stature, but lesser in authorities, often attend to this. And from bureaucratic politics model, you often get intermediate steps or interim steps on the way to results. And so you have what's sometimes dismissively called the bureaucratic response. Not quite the same as the organizational response, that's at a different order, but rather you get often stands. Here's where I stand on this issue, and here's the typical action. You're likely also in bureaucratic politics to get numbers of folks getting to yes, looking for compromises, looking for trade-offs. So instead of the clarity of these missiles will not stand, you might, for instance, say, well, maybe some of the missiles could stand, or maybe we would take them out over a long period of time, or maybe we would trade this, that, or the other thing. The other point about bureaucratic politics that you have to be very careful of is dominant personalities. Remember that Lyndon Johnson was part of the XCOM, and several of the other characters who were involved with the XCOM. These are very powerful elephants in the room, and they didn't really take kindly to others. They like to be on transmit, and so we have dominant influences. So you have to be very careful when you're setting up, for instance, your own instructional leadership committees or the various school committees having to do with differentiated instruction or IEPs, whatever else, that you're not so loading those with dominant personalities that there really isn't an exchange. So you could have rational actor model, you could have organizational behavior model, you could have bureaucratic politics model engage with any set of decisions. So let's go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis just a little bit. The intended results, well, withdrawal of the Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba, very clear. That's the president's from beginning. Ultimately, and this goes on to the 20th of November, it isn't over on the 28th of October, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The withdrawal of the IL-28 light bombers, that occurs on the 20th of November. There's a trade here that Bobby Kennedy and others work out about our commitment that there be no invasion of Cuba to remove the missiles. And there were other secret deals as well about the missiles in Turkey. But those did not, that exchange meant that the missiles in Turkey wouldn't be removed for another 6 or 7 months, and that done in secrecy. So then there are intended unknowns within it. Turkey removal of the Jupiter missiles is one of those. The long-term agreement that with the Soviet Union that the United States would not invade Cuba except without direct provocation is a long-term commitment of the United States. Success in Cuba did not mean success in Berlin for the Soviet Union. In fact, the Berlin issue kind of faded away. Castro lost lots of face through unintended consequences in the Cuban Missile Crisis or crisis in the Caribbean. Khrushchev definitely lost clout, and his clout was less and less until he died. The creation of nuclear hotline was an unintended consequence that was a very beneficial one, happened sometime after this. And then there was, as I said, very importantly, the weakening of the Berlin issue. So lots of very complicated things were going on. I invite you to use these models, the rational actor model, organizational behavior model, bureaucratic politics model, in your own deliberations about important decisions. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the case on the Cuban Missile Crisis.